The AAA game industry can kind of suck. It seems like all they do is repeat the same thing over and over again and see what sticks. There can be some really scummy people in the games industry just selling you a game you bought years prior but with a different number slapped onto it. But you can always count on indie developers to be all the way in the back trying to do something new. Skatebird is a game coming out in 2021 and I'm really excited for it because you're literally grinding on a skateboard with a bird. It's gonna be really cool. And then there's Fall Guys, which is the new trend right now, where it's basically a battle royale but with platforming and it's tons of fun. Spiritfarer and Way to the Woods are two games coming out soon that just ooze style, and yet we know virtually nothing about them, and they're coming out later this year. But that doesn't matter because the people who are behind these games are just like you and me. Just people who have an appreciation for games and are pushing their creations out in the open. And you have to admit, that kind of stuff takes a whole lot of courage and determination. When you put your game out like that, you're facing off against some literal juggernauts in the game industry and just hoping that you can stand a chance. And some studios actually managed to do that. The Behemoth developed Castle Crashers, which was the big game in 2008 because of its self-aware humor and spunk in a year mostly dominated by gritty first-person shooters. Team Meat developed Super Meat Boy, which came out a few years later, and it was also a big hit due to its outrageous difficulty. Now that I'm looking at it, I probably should have included it in my difficulty video. Before the year 2004, indie games weren't as big as they are today. Most indie studios in the late 90s, early 2000s were mostly there in plain sight, but just weren't noticed. Compared to today, indie games were basically non-existent. There needed to be some sort of break, some sort of endearing, lovable, and memorable indie game to put indie titles on the map. And in 2004, that exact thing happened. Cave Story came out on Microsoft Windows and it became an instant classic. Daisuke Yamaya, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, had this crazy ass vision for a Metroidvania with actual characters and beautiful settings, and it paid off so well that indie games in the eyes of the gaming community basically changed forever. Cave Story all in all is basically a one-man job. Daisuke wrote the entire game, he composed all the music and was the only person programming the entire game, and for some reason he made the whole game free through freeware when it was released. No matter how you look at it, you gotta respect him. Daisuke created the entirety of Cave Story not for money, but because he just had a genuine appreciation for gaming and its artistry. Unfortunately, the scumbags noticed that Callus would take the Cave Story IP through some really shitty transaction that went through Daisuke's nose. But as much as I would love to shit on a Callus, the main focus on this video will be on Daisuke and his fantastic work on Cave Story. When you start Cave Story, you're a small robot with amnesia traveling through these linear passageways in a cave. This entire section is a good way to adjust a player to the game's basics before getting into the real meat of the game. The cave itself is surprisingly dark and narrow despite the jumpy music that accompanies it. Once you leave the cave, however, you get transported to this huge area in the form of an island. And this is where the meat of Cave Story really starts to begin. You're open to explore all these areas with brimming colors and enemies that are so expressive and different. You discover this new species called Mimiga all over all the areas, and they all have their own distinct roles and personalities. You travel through a place called the Egg Corridor, which is one of my favorite locations in the whole game. The place is layered with a bunch of eggs that are supposedly dragon eggs, and you fight bees, elephants, and other mutated animals before fighting a mutated Mimiga to continue the plot. Everything I just said sounded really weird, but that's what makes the game so lovable. It's that creativity. Later, you meet up with a girl named Sue who plans on leaving the island with her brother, who is missing. If you want to escape the island with her and get some of your memories back, you gotta find her brother Kazuma, who's being held in a place called Grasstown, which I'll get into in a bit. After finding Kazuma, you find out he isn't the only one missing. He's being accompanied by someone named Professor Booster. After they run off, you teleport back to Mimiga Village, where Professor Booster breaks down what's really going on. He reveals that a mysterious doctor plans on using a flower called the Red Flower to mutate Mimigas to make an evil Mimiga army to take over the entire surface world. And that's all I'm gonna tell you. You go from being in a cave to being in a village to being in a lake of field. You go to a factory of dragon eggs, an open grassy field, and more in just the first quarter of the game. There's so much variety in Cave Story, and each area is filled with so much character and personality. It all feels so refined, like everything was made from scratch. Which it was, because one guy made it. Daisuke put so much care into this world without even saying that much. There's a noticeable abundance of tutorials, as the cave in the beginning is literally just that. There's no static walls of text from each character you talk to, and it actually feels like you're talking to a character rather than a robot who gives you hints. Hell, you even play as a robot, and they show more personality than most AAA games. You meet a woman named Chaco in Grasslands who needs you to get jellyfish juice. You find a guy fishing in Mimiga Village. You can find an old woman named Jenka in Sand Zone, and you need to find her dogs. There's so much distinction between each level, each area, and it makes you want to explore, which a good Metroidvania should do, and saying Cave Story is a good Metroidvania is a massive understatement. Cave Story, by 2004 standards, seems to have everything a game should have and more. The area, story, gameplay, and characters are all so unique, if we're talking about 2004. Compared to today, most elements Cave Story has kind of stands in the shadow of some other indie games. But guess what those indie games took inspiration from? Chances are one of them was Cave Story. Even if the gameplay is one of the weaker elements, it's still pretty good. You have this progression system of leveling up by killing enemies but losing XP by taking damage. It's a fun system even if it's overshadowed by games that took inspiration from it, like Shovel Knight for example. There's a large array of weapons that you can purchase in that game that all serve some sort of purpose, just like Cave Story. The level design of Cave Story, which encourages exploration and tackling enemies in different ways, apparently inspired the likes of Mega Man 9 and 11. The art style of Cave Story, which is jumpy and colorful, which makes each area as distinct as it is, inspired Braid in 2009. Cave Story inspired so many different elements to so many different games. It was a key aspect to the resurgence in Metroidvanias and other genres that you gotta ask yourself at one point, what this game didn't do for the game industry. Is Cave Story all that original? At the time, yes, but nowadays there's not so much the game can call its own. But that's just because of how influential it was to so many different people and developers. Cave Story isn't just a good game. It's got all this character and spunk, but at the end of the day, it's also a very important game. It inspired so many different indie games to come after it, and without it, I don't think indie games would be where they are today. So thank you, Daisuke and Maya, and fuck you, Nicalis. Why did I buy Blade Strain?